Terry Mancour, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Terrence. I appreciate you having me on.
Hey, you are one of the writers I actually read the most, believe it or not. The Spellmonger
Well,
series is, I probably go through about 5 or 6 of the books every quarter, just because they're amazing audiobooks, they're amazing books, and truly, truly a pleasure to have you on the show today.
well, thank you so much. And I do have to give a lot of credit to the narrator of the audiobook series. Podium Publishing, which is my audiobook publisher, chose John Lee as the main narrator for the Spellmonger series. And he has just the most gorgeous voice. He really does. And his background in drama has he's a trained Shakespearean actor, I believe, and so he really knows how to change his inflection, his accents, and that sort of thing in ways that honestly not a lot of other narrators have been able to do, and it's really brought a tremendous sense of depth and communicated my characters in ways I couldn't even anticipate it.
So actually, if you don't mind my asking, kind of start
Sure.
off here, when the audiobook started, that change any of the way that you wrote the dialogue or prose for
Yes, it
Spellmonger?
did. It did, and I didn't even realize it until I started. I guess it was probably book 8 or 9 when that started to evolve. When I realized that that these books weren't going to be just read, but listened to, it subtly changed how I attributed uh, the who was speaking at any particular time. Because if you're reading, you can kind of pick it out just based on the back and forth. But if you're listening, it has the possibility of getting confused. So
Mm-hmm.
I started putting a lot more attributions. He said, she said, that sort of thing, just to make it clear in the listener's mind who's speaking. That was the biggest alteration I did. And then, and I hate to admit this, but I started coming up with cool things to put in the books just so I could listen to John Lee say them, and everything from uh, uh, the infamous Rickroll, which those who are just starting out the series, I feel so ashamed about having included it. But yes, there is a Rickroll somewhere in the series, and from what I understand, it's been highly popular. It works with the flow of the story. Listening to John Lee say it was just an incredible coup. It's also been the cause of several near accidents on highway systems as various drivers come across it and realize what I've done. And then the other thing that I put in specifically so I could hear John say it is the hymn to Bova in one of the books where basically it ends with mooing, and I wanted to hear John Lee woo, so I added that as well.
I heard a story that Stephen Fry told about J.K. Rowling. He had trouble saying the word Harry pocketed it. There's just he kept slipping up on saying it. So he asked J.K. Rowling, would you mind if I changed it? She was like, no. He also noticed that every book subsequently had that phrase in it.
That's hysterical. That really is. And to John's credit, I have never thrown anything at him that he could not handle, and he has never asked me for a revision like that, which is a credit to his professionalism and his ability.
You have the prose is amazing. I want to get into Spellmonger more, but first,
Sure.
I want to ask about you as a writer. Like, what got you started writing? Where did your journey go to the point where now you are the Archmage?
Okay, well, that's a great question. I am one of the few writers you've probably ever spoken to who actually started out wanting to be a fantasy science fiction writer. Since I was when I was 8 years old, I got a copy of The Hobbit,
Mm-hmm.
and just never got over it, really. And since that by the time I got to about 13, and the inevitable, what do you want to do with the rest of your life questions started coming up. I found out when I was 13 that writers actually get paid to write, which was kind of a revelation to me, because I was already making up stories myself. And once I realized that you could make a living doing that, it changed my entire perspective. And from that point on, I decided, I'll probably do a lot of stuff, but what I want to do is write. As a matter of fact, I recently came across an essay that I did on that subject from junior high school,
Oh, that's so cool.
where I mentioned that I want to be a scumbag fantasy writer who puts out at least one book a year right before Christmas and can coast the rest of the year. Of
It's a
course,
dream.
yeah, it is. It is. I am literally living my dream job, and ironically, it's one of many dream jobs that I've had in the past. Everything from uh, working in the adult industry as a copywriter, which I did for a number of years, to running a specialty coffee company, which I did for also a number
Ooh.
of years. So I've got a very diverse background that goes into, and of course, a lot of that seeps into my writing. But I always started out with the goal of becoming a fantasy writer. I love fantasy, always have. I love magic. And I love science fiction as well. So Spellmonger is really the culmination of all of my interests
Hmm.
piling together and stacking up.
The series does an amazing job of balancing being fantasy, but also having sci-fi, the science fiction elements to it in a way that blends beautifully. Was that the plan from the start?
It kind of was. If you go back and read the very first book, Spellmonger, again, which a lot of people like to back over that a couple of times
Hmm.
as they go later on in the series, just to see the seeds that I planted that pay off later on in the series. There are a few kind of throwaway references that suggest that this is not your typical fantasy world, and I specifically designed Calidor, the world on which Spellmonger is set, as a science fiction oriented world,
Hmm.
and but with a heavy fantasy overlay. So the Spellmonger series is essentially a science fiction series with that disguised as a fantasy series, but the magic is quite real.
Hmm.
It's not just technology disguised. And to do that, I had to delve deeply into quantum physics and some spooky, murky areas of science. But I think I've come up with a fairly believable system of magic, which is
Hmm.
a vitally important thing for a fantasy series to have.
Well, that's one of the things so the irony is I came across Spellmonger at the same time as I started listening to a lecture series on the history of the English language.
Oh, wow.
And so that for whatever reason, those two things like have remained intertwined in my head, where your books, A, have a consistency of the magic system
Hmm.
that is amazing, and also a consistency in the language
Mm.
of the culture that you've created and that world. How much of that consistency was purposeful versus by just sheer doing of the thing?
Well, quite a bit of it actually, and I've certainly made some minor errors over the course of the series, and occasionally had to come up with plausible reasons for those errors. As a matter of fact, I've written entire books to correct errors before, or at least keep from having to retcon something and come up with a plausible explanation. But my primary inspiration has always been Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
I've read the Lord of the Rings over 300 times at this point. I don't have the advantage that he did, that I'm not a philologist. He knew the bare
Mm-hmm.
bones of language better than any fantasy writer out there. But while I'm not a philologist, I can do research and I can fake it. And that's essentially what I did. I have done a fair amount of research on uh, uh, early modern English and late medieval English.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, love archaic words. I have peppered my series with archaic words. And sometimes even the words that I have to invent are based on a phrase or a word from archaic English that I think needs to be reintroduced. And so it being consistent, that's the important thing, though. And I think that a lot of fantasy writers, and I'm not going to mention any names, but they don't do enough research and they don't
Mm-hmm.
stay consistent enough. Um, for example, again, without naming names, a very popular series that I started reading, and I don't often read other people's fantasy just to keep from unconscious plagiarism from creeping
Yeah.
in. But someone threw this book at me and said, "Hey, you need to read this," and I started to. Really good stuff, but I got to the point where in this medieval fantasy world, we had essentially a Hebrew name that was
Oh.
thrown in because it sounded like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I guess whatever the author's reason, they threw in this name. And that one thing pulled me entirely out of the series.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have always tried to make my naming conventions consistent. Different regions will have different sorts of customs when it comes to names. Place names will suggest themselves, and I'll try to be more or less consistent with that. But just studying how language evolves, and
Mm-hmm.
English is a great language for for evolution. It's one of the most utilitarian but most expressive languages in the world. And being able to tap into that rich history and bring it into my fantasy, in addition to some naming conventions from other mostly European languages, since Spellmonger is the world of Calidor is mostly was settled by European refugees, basically European colonists. So there are good, consistent reasons for why I've selected those naming conventions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, so I'm a big fan of like medieval times, like that era. Just read a fascinating book by Dan Jones on uh, Thrones and Powers, I think was the name of the book, but basically just an overview of the medieval age as we know it. And one of the things that has struck me from with Spellmonger is just how accurate you make medieval life. Mage Lord, I think it's the third book in the series, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And it does such a great job of setting up that this is a feudal society with a very clear outline of how feudal politics worked that doesn't usually make it into fantasy.
Well, and not just feudal politics, but feudal economics,
Mm-hmm.
feudal food, and food security is a major element throughout the entire
Yeah.
Middle Ages. And I really credit, believe it or not just a huge amount of research, original source documentation specifically, but also my participation for a number of years in the Society for Creative Anachronism. The SCA, where I was known as Lord Ian McAngus of Cowgate. And the combination of studying the original source materials, and I mostly went for things like manorial court records,
Mm-hmm.
which England has a ton of, and they're fascinating to read.
Can I just say
Um,
those are some of the most fun parts of the various books you've written? You will include these wonderful scenes where judgment is being made in the court, and they're
mhm.
very entertaining.
Well, thank you so much. And they lend themselves to that as you're reading these court records, and they seem pretty dry on the surface, but when you try to imagine how that scene must have played out, you can find jokes in those things if
Chapo the
you
Root.
right. Yes, one of my favorite characters. I've been tempted to kill him off like four times now, and people are like, "No, you can't kill Joppo." So I haven't martined him yet, but Another character, Olmec, started off as kind of a minor, just throwaway
Mhm.
character, but it also grew. But I really wanted to write something again in a even though this is technically science fiction. I wanted you to really be able to smell the peasants when
Mhm.
you read through or listen to, particularly Mage Lord, which was my deep dive on medieval feudal politics and culture, and the very stratified layers of society uh, that still allowed for some mobility. And I think if you study the Middle Ages and study the lives of the people in the Middle Ages, you'll find that as stratified as their culture was, there were still areas where you could. Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror or The Calamitous 14th Century, beautiful source book for just understanding how the realms of the nobility and the peasantry and the artisan class and all
Mhm.
that work together to make a fully functioning whole. And I borrowed heavily from that and from several other historical books about the Middle Ages in order to lend authenticity to the Spellmonger series.
So we touched on character just a minute ago. You have an amazing cast that continues to grow, and every time you introduce even some of these little side characters like Olmec, they sometimes get the opportunity to evolve into a very rich character on their own. However, you are at 15 books, so I'm just curious, like, how do you maintain continuity for those
Yeah,
characters? Do you have a method of like keeping track of everyone?
well, I've got spreadsheets that get out of date surprisingly quickly. I have to credit my fans actually for putting together the Spellmonger wiki, and I have to give a shout out to David and the other guys who have been working on that, who help keep track of some of the details. But a lot of times it involves going back and rereading my own work and finding surprising gems and having my fans ask me questions, difficult questions, which forces me to go back, reread my work, and try to be consistent with that. And I can get away with a certain amount of play in how a character is presented based on perspective
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that I maintain for the most part a first person perspective from my main character's point of view. But then every couple of books, I'll do something from somebody else's perspective and change to third person. That allows me a little more play because different people have different opinions and different
Mm-hmm.
insights. But that being said, there's a lot of detail that I have to go through. I'm working on book 16 now, as well as a new anthology, as well as the third book in the Legacy and Secrets
Mm-hmm.
young adult trilogy. And so I've got four of my previous books open on my computer right now as I go back and find the details that I need to make everything consistent within that. So there's a lot of review on my part, a lot of fan interaction, and my children actually, my boys have plunged into kind of handling some of the details and some of the social media interaction and that sort of thing. And they're really good about bringing up, hey, you forgot about this guy, or hey, he can't be here because he's over here. And I also have a really good editor and co-author on the Legacy and Secrets, Emily Birch Harris. Has edited all of the, and I say edited, not proofread.
Mm-hmm.
There is a distinction,
Yes.
and she has kept me fairly between all those, the editor, my boys, the fans, and me reviewing. We muddle through when it comes to maintaining the consistency of character and all that. But and some of them are easy because they're based on people I know, and so I just go, well, what would George do right there? And I'll have the character do what my friend or my acquaintance or in some cases my enemies will do. I have based a number of characters on people I know, and some of the best villains. For example, I'm not going to mention which character it is, but one of my characters is based on my junior high school band director. uh, who I swore I'd get revenge on, and by God, I've done it. But he makes a great villain, and every time I throw him in there, I feel a little happy inside. So.
I've seen a couple of memes that are like, be careful how you treat authors because you never know how they're going to kill you off.
Exactly, exactly.
In with those characters, you talked a little bit about how each has different perspective, and you sometimes change from the first person of Minilin, the main character, to other people's perspectives throughout the series. That's one of the things that I remember when I think it's Knight's Magi is the first book
Mhm.
where we depart from Minilin's pure perspective. And I remember being like, how is this going to play? But it was a very quick transition. And all of a sudden, you don't notice. It's fascinating because I was reading a book called Character by Robert McKee.
Mhm.
Great book. Really enjoyed it. But he talks about how a large cast reveals different things about the main character
Right.
because how he interacts with them changes the way you view the story. You kind of use that for Calidor and the
Yes.
world itself, where the world itself is revealed through the different perspectives of the different people.
Right. And my philosophy on that is essentially that there was more story to the Civil War than just what Rhett Butler saw.
Yeah.
Uh, there's when you're talking, every character is the main character in their own mind,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the book series that focus on a central main character to the exclusion of all the others, some of those are perfectly great books, but I think they're losing an opportunity um, to explore both the world at large and a different perspective of the main character by doing that. My philosophy has always been the two basic fundamentals of a good fantasy series or good fantasy experience are the magic system, first of all,
Mm-hmm.
and then the world building. And I do my best to subtly make Calidor a character of its own throughout the course of the series because that's why people go to fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Wish fulfillment through the magical system, and then being put in a world that they want to live in. And I tried to make Calidor as inviting and as exciting and as exotic as possible, but familiar enough so that and again, this goes back to how Tolkien played things. Uh, we wouldn't like to live in Middle Earth probably unless we lived in the Shire where everything
Mm-hmm.
is nice and comfortable and yeah, there's good beer and stuff. And I wanted to bring that same sort of philosophy to Calidor in the Spellmonger series.
I mean, even in the so I was as I'm rereading these books and as I'm preparing for this interview, one of the things that really struck me is your use of exposition doesn't tend to be boring. Like
Right.
because you use it to reveal things and tease out ideas, it actually has you interested in being there, listening to it or reading it instead of, oh, well, we have to get through this scene to get to the next one.
Right, and I get my wife actually when she first read Spellmonger before I did an extensive rewrite on it. I had a huge block of exposition that would was just she couldn't get past it, and uh, I had to go back and figure out how to break that down into nice, neat, bite-sized chunks that people would enjoy reading. And in terms of influence, believe it or not, I think I probably learned more from the James Herriot All Creatures Great and Small books,
Yes.
uh, and how he was able to because he was doing world building as well. He was describing a
Mm-hmm.
world that by the time he wrote those books didn't exist anymore,
Yeah.
and so for a lot of his exposition. He had to tell it in an entertaining sort of way and breaking it down into smaller stories that handled a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time over the course of the books. That really that kind of sedimentary writing builds up in the reader's mind to the point that makes a more cohesive world. And so I've always tried to handle exposition in a way that's entertaining by putting it in some sort of story. And sometimes it's not an exposition that has any great influence on the outcome of the major characters of the story, but it's something that I find essential, like the coinage system, you know,
Yes.
the difference between raising sheep and raising cows, again, things I've pulled from my medieval research, but I find fascinating enough in and of themselves. And like no one really talks about, you know, the coinage system in Middle Earth, although
Yeah.
there had to be commerce there and all this. And so I wanted to explore it, but explore it in an interesting enough way that entertains the reader. And sometimes it just gets out of hand. I've had
Mhm.
5-page letters from fans about stuff like my coinage system, or how much you can um, inflate a currency by adding different metals to the gold, and stuff like that. To the point where I wonder if these people are missing the point of the fantasy series as a whole. But I also cheese making, another
Mhm.
excellent. I go deeply into cheese making, something I've done a fair amount of research on. But those expository moments,
Mhm.
and sometimes they do stretch on, but you encapsulate them in an interesting story with interesting characters, and usually a problem that needs to be explained. So that's kind of my philosophy on exposition. Make it entertaining. There's no reason it can't be entertaining, and if it's that boring, you know, that just means you need to up your game as a writer and make it entertaining. So.
It's a good way of thinking of it because conflict is story. So if you have
Mhm.
the exposition there to solve a conflict, then inherently it's going to have people more interested.
Right, exactly.
You touched on the economy of the world,
Mhm.
which Enchanter is probably the book that I actually have reread the most. I
Mhm.
think part of that is because, so within the context of the book, it's them developing these magical implements in
Right.
essence. And the question of what effect does that have on the economy of this feudal society is a question that keeps going on throughout the books.
Right.
And I just have to say that was a fascinating and a genuinely interesting question because I don't know how intentional it is to contrast with the evolution of technology in general, but it's a valid thing as society continues to create new things.
Mhm. Well, and that's something I wanted to attack, and attack on an iterative basis, because when we think about the evolution of technology, we tend to think about it only in terms of our own experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if you consider magic, as Arthur C. Clarke did, as just a technology that we don't understand yet, which I think is a perfectly appropriate way to view it. Um, I think that the introduction of a new way of doing something is always going to have an effect, uh, and its impact on the lives of the common people is something that I think a lot of fantasy authors just ignore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, magic is for wizards, and they do wizard things over here, and the peasants still do things the same old dumb boring way over here. And in Spellmonger, especially with for example, the introduction of the agricultural wands.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, these are magical tools that allow agriculture to not be the miserable, backbreaking, heartbreaking experience that it was quite so much in the Middle Ages, which sounds great, just like tractors sounded great back during the early part of the Industrial Revolution. But those tractors had profound effects
Mm-hmm.
on the way that society evolved. Suddenly, you could do the same work with one man that it used to take 10 to do, and you know that sounds great until you realize those people who work those farms had rent to pay, and food to buy, and without those jobs you had a large unemployment issue that popped up. And I've tried to address this in the Spellmonger series. And the fact of the matter is, there are going to be problems, and people are going to
Yeah.
suffer any new introduction and that changes their economy in a fundamental way. And when you're talking about subsistence farming, and there are certainly parallels to the industrialization of agriculture in especially Britain and France, but they don't always fall out exactly the same way. And I think I'm excited about some of the forthcoming books because there
Ooh.
are other elements of both technology and magic that will continue to screw with this lovely idyllic medieval world that I've built. And I think it's just going to be a lot of fun to explore those, and they're not necessarily going to evolve in the same ways that we would predict based on our own experience with the Industrial Revolution.
I'm looking forward to it. As I said, it's one of the things that caught me as fascinating reading the book, and it always intrigues me as it comes up throughout the
Mm-hmm.
series. Something that you've done with this series that I have to give you a lot of kudos and credit on and ask your thoughts on is War Mage. We had Minilin go from, okay, it's the book just before he gets married. Then
Right.
Mage Lord, we see him now married. He ends up with a kid. That's book 3. We
Yeah.
normally don't. I grew up with the idea that heroes don't get married and have kids and then still have adventures.
Well,
Yet that's
yeah.
something you have made happen since book 3.
Yeah, actually, and I laid the foundations for that in book 1, because and my marriage is probably one of the most important things in my life. To be honest, it's where my kids came from. It's the cornerstone of my functional stability as an adult. My wife and I just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. Uh,
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. We've actually been together 31 years, but we've been married for 25, which there are countries that are not that old. And I'm very appreciative of how well we work together and the life that we've made for each other. Um, and honestly, I got sick of the whole idea of the stag hero who Aragorn doesn't get married until the end of the book
Mm-hmm.
in Lord of the Rings, and honestly, my marriage is one of the most exciting things about my life, and I wanted to portray a hero in a relationship that wasn't fraught with inherent problems. Um, I wanted to show the adventure of married life
Mm-hmm.
from all the admittedly I haven't had undead girlfriends come back to the past and threaten my stability, but um, I wanted to explore some things about marriage and relationships, and he's not everybody is happily married in my books, but because of the class that he came from and the class that his wife came from, they've escaped uh, the kind of drudgery of peasant marriage
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of backbiting and undermining that you see in a lot of noble marriages. And in that way, they're very fortunate, and they do deeply love each other. They do. That doesn't mean that Menelin isn't a flawed character
Mm-hmm.
and has had some fidelity issues from time to time. But especially, and I'm glad you brought up Enchanter, that was kind of a turning point for him as a character,
Yeah.
uh, where all of a sudden, the allure of an kind of an extramarital affair, because of the trauma he endured in that book, he's just not into it anymore. And in a lot of ways, I think that represents a change that as men in a relationship, they hit a certain point where they realize that the answer to their problems is not enough, including another woman in their lives. And I wanted to again explore that, and then the subsequent fallout from Enchanter
Mm-hmm.
really is still reverberating throughout the rest of the books, and has presented some really interesting challenges in portraying how the story has moved forward, and also how the character of Menelin and his wife Alia have developed. And honestly, having Pentandra as a secondary character,
Yes.
who surprisingly starting out as a sex magician,
Hmm.
and finding greater happiness as a wife and mother. I think that that's a very different perspective than you see in a lot of contemporary fantasy, which wants to promote the idea that a magical career or a career as a warrior or something like that is going to be as fulfilling as these more domestic issues. And with Pentandra, that gives us an interesting perspective on Minilin's marriage
Hmm.
when she sees the happiness that he has, and she's his ex-girlfriend, so no
Yeah.
one's going to tell you the truth more than your ex-girlfriend. And having that perspective and then having that change in her character was a lot of fun to write, and it's seeing Pentandra, the former sex magician, as a mother is also one of my favorite things to explore, because sex has consequences, and
Hmm.
kids are part of that. That's I think a more realistic and holistic way to approach things than a lot of fantasy writers are willing to do.
Well, it has such dimensionality. The way that
Yes.
you've constructed your characters and the fact that they actually have home lives,
Hmm.
where that's not the question for most fantasy authors. Really, a lot of what they do, especially Minolin, it's with the idea I need to protect the home that I'm building. I need to protect
Right.
the people. And he's not just lone wolfing it to do that. He actually does like going back home, which is, again, just a concept that doesn't show up often.
Well, if you've ever been on a real adventure, they suck. I mean, just in terms, when you think of everything that Bilbo went through
Mhm.
in The Hobbit, um, that was a really miserable time. And I think that it's only when you get back and you can appreciate the good things about the adventure that you overcome the bad things about the adventure.
Mhm.
Minlin has been thrust repeatedly into situations where he's had to do exciting and exotic things that have really sucked.
Yeah.
Going to war in the Middle Ages was not a fun time. Uh, Walking, across the land, leading a bunch of refugee kids, not a good time. Camping is great for a weekend, but when you have to do it for 9 weeks straight, even in ideal conditions, it kind of sucks. And having that domestic refuge to return to, I think is something that a lot of fantasy writers don't explore. And I've wanted to get into that a little bit and understand these characters in a more complex way, I think. Um, and I think I've accomplished that to a certain extent, but there are still some things that I want to get into that we haven't gotten to yet.
Well, I'm excited to keep reading and keep seeing where it goes. Uh, what was it like developing your own pantheon?
Oh, that was fun.
Because
That was a lot of fun. Let me explain some of my background, because that will
please
help.
do.
Well, first of all, I am not a Christian. I am a polytheist by religion, a Druid, and have been for years. I was also a religious studies major at the
Okay.
University of North Carolina. And I think that one of the most fascinating books I've ever read is the Varieties of Religious Experience by Mircea Eliade,
Okay.
who I was introduced to at UNC in the Religious Studies department. Um, and a comprehensive exploration of the evolution of religion from Neolithic times to the
Hmm.
present. It's really a fascinating work if you're that kind of geek, and I certainly am. Um, in constructing the pantheon, and it's fascinating to me because the way that I set up the magical system
Hmm.
kind of uh, kind of it suggests that there needs to be some sort of pantheon of divinities, or at least higher powered beings that evolved from the collective unconscious of humanity in ways that no other race on Calidor enjoys. Uh, Different races express magic differently, and this is
Mhm.
just happens to be a side effect. You get wizards and you get gods from humanity. Not everybody's got magic, but everybody has a subconscious, and
Mhm.
the works of Jung and Iliada and a number of other authors have kind of informed the psychological reasons why we need divinity,
Mhm.
expressions of divinity, and sometimes very specific expressions of divinity. They usually reflect our culture and the vital things about our culture and our economy. For example, the 12 Olympians, sure, you've got the Zeus and Pluto and Poseidon for the big elemental things. But then you've got Dionysus. And why do you have Dionysus? It's not just because people like getting drunk. It's because wine was the cornerstone of the Greek
Mhm.
Empire's Greek commercial empire in the Mediterranean. Same thing with Athena and her being the patroness of olives, the olive
Mhm.
tree, the naming of Athens. Olive oil and wine, that's what made Greek fortunes for hundreds of years. And so their divinities reflected that. And as you go through to uh, uh, the Roman civilizations, and later Byzantium and before Christianity, you see how the popularity of the gods usually reflects the the economic needs
Mhm.
of a particular culture. When we're talking about a feudal culture, for uh, various reasons, the monotheisms were weeded out of Calidor. Basically, in a world where human collective subconscious belief can manifest as an actual thought form with power and agency,
Mhm.
uh, having someone like Shiva or the Old Testament Jehovah pop up and decide, I don't like this world, I'm going to rub it out, it is an existential threat.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at a pantheon that not only I designed as the author, but within the world of Calidor was kind of sculpted and designed
Mhm.
at the end of the colonial period and the beginning of after the inundation of Perwin, with the help of the Alcalan. And this is probably the only spoiler I'm going to drop, but Lelastian, the sorceress of Sortha Wood, and the last surviving member of the Calidor College of Surgeons, is she was involved in uh, designing the initial pantheons uh, for
Oh.
humanity after the fall of Herwin, as they had to readapt to life as subsistence farmers and artisans, basically. And so that initial pantheon was very regulated and very specifically chosen. But human collective unconscious doesn't work that way. And as well designed as it was, you had all these tribes on the edges of society that had their own beliefs and their own economics, including the uh, Narasi barbarians on the northern steppes, who had a very different concept of what something like law or growing grain or horses from the more civilized people in the south, and that's where you have the fun part. And it's not just one pantheon either.
Mhm.
Um, the Sea Lords have their own pantheon, which we'll be exploring actually in the upcoming Shadowblade book.
Okay.
And as we explore further and further out from the five duchies, we will see other pantheons uh, emerge. Now, the fun thing though is that I get to write the gods as characters as much as set pieces in the background, and bringing forth the personalities of Briga or Ishi or even Trig it has been a riot. I mean, Ishii has had some of the best lines in the entire series.
Amazing character.
Yeah, and I have heard there are people who are now using Ishii's tits as a epithet.
I do. After I listen to the book, after I go through a Spellmonger series, I find myself using the epithets, which
Yeah,
is
well, and
brilliant.
they you're going to find out why Ishii was so important.
Okay.
It's kind of banal to throw in a sex goddess just for the sake of titillation or novelty. But there was a very specific reason why Ishii was not just included but promoted in Calidor's history. And when we get to that, it'll be fascinating, I think, to explore that. And she is. I get some crap sometimes from people who say I'm over sexualizing the sex goddess, which I just find incredibly amusing. But I also would suggest that it's kind of an exploration of femininity, not just the sex goddess, but balancing her with Trig, the mother goddess,
Yep.
and then the various crone goddesses. As I said, I'm a polytheist, and I've studied the I guess you could say the Wiccan trinity of Mother, Maiden, and Crone,
Yep.
and even use that. But I think that there is some really deep-seated and very profound meaning in examining those figures and how they're reflections of a woman's life. And again, I get crap for it because I'm a dude, and proudly heterosexual and happily married. But because I have a mother, I have a wife, I have a daughter. It's always femininity in general has fascinated me as much as masculinity, and being able to explore that at the archetypical level. And over the course of a woman's life has just been amazingly given me a lot of insight and a lot of appreciation for that.
I have writing questions I want to ask next, but
Sure,
I
good.
do have to say Harris is one of my favorite characters
Mm-hmm.
because he definitely fits his popping up. You can always tell something's about to happen. That's
Yes,
perhaps not what Middelin wanted to have happen that day.
right. And he's not the only god that does that. In the forthcoming book 16, Slogger, the god of games, who
Okay,
is
another amazing character.
yeah, he is, and he's based loosely on the Norse god of games, uh,
Okay.
but very loosely. He's a little
Mm-hmm.
more erudite, and he makes the distinction, and I just wrote this, so it's still fresh in my mind. Um, that games are a simulation, how we and they allow us to distill um, a fundamental element out of a situation and put it into representation form, and all games are a balance of order and chaos, meaning the rules and the randomness. Even chess, which only has one random element, and that's who goes first, but that determines the entire play of the game.
Yeah.
And just exploring high concepts like that from the mouth of a god. First of all, it's a lot of pressure because you can't screw that up, as an author, or things are going to ring hollow. And you don't just want to steal an off the shelf pantheon or off the shelf
Yeah.
divinity from history, because this is a specific world. Brigga is based on the Celtic goddess Brigid. Um,
Okay.
very, very specifically. But she has evolved into her own thing as time has gone on in her own character. And that when she shows up, yes, whenever a god shows up, stuff's
Things
going to happen.
happen. Odd thing, gods show up, things happen. It's almost like one influences the other. You talked about your writing right now.
Yes.
You have produced an amazing amount of work. My question is, like, do you have a writing routine? And if so, what does it look like?
Okay. Yeah. I have been, to quote Isaac Asimov, if you can't write good, write lots. And he wrote over 100 books by the time he passed away. I published 4 books last year,
Mm-hmm.
from Hedge Witch, all the way through to Martial Arcane. And Yeah, it can be demanding. At this point, the Spellmonger universe, I think, has over 4 million words of fiction in it,
Wow.
and over 1,000 distinct characters. So that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And it is, it is. But Yeah, let's face it, trilogies are so 20th century.
So 20th century.
I wanted to do something long form.
Mm-hmm.
When I started out, and honestly, when Podium Publishing agreed to not only buy all of the Spellmonger books, but all future Spellmonger books, I didn't want to write myself out of a paycheck someday, and so I plotted the Spellmonger series for 30 books, and I fully intend on finishing each and every one of them. And that's 30 main series books, with
Mm-hmm.
not counting all the side adventures and single novels that I have done and will do in the future. So yeah, it's a lot, and I do have a writing routine. I usually get up about 5:30 in the morning, because everybody else is usually asleep at that point, and I can have about 4 or 5 hours of uninterrupted time to myself, where I can either do research or plunge into writing prose. Um, and Then, depending on when my deadline is, I mean, I've had days where I've put in 14-hour days at the keyboard just grinding.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. It can be exhausting. I've had to uh, come up with a certain routine where I can't do more than 90 minutes without getting up from my chair at least.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, my back just uh, uh, cranks up really bad. So, but when it comes down to it, I and one of the secrets is having multiple things that I'm working on at one time,
Mm-hmm.
because if you get stuck on one book, being able to switch over to another one with a different perspective, a different character, a different situation, sometimes that can shake loose the problems that you're having in the first one. So I always try to have at least 3 or 4 books on the back burner, ready to jump into if I get stuck, or if I get bored. As exciting as the Spellmonger books are, from a writer's perspective, when you're going through what you've already written like the second or third time, and you're looking for spelling mistakes, or you want to subtly correct a character or something like that, you can just live in your own world so much that you get sick of it. And being able to switch over to something completely different is vital, I think, in order to keep your productivity up. This year I will only be publishing 3 books, so I'm taking it light.
Good job.
uh,
You deserve it.
um, and Based on the deadlines that I've got, which is unusual, because when I started as an indie writer, one of the things that appealed to me is the fact that I didn't have deadlines, and that the moment I was done with the book, I got to slap it up on Kindle and start on the next one and all that. But now, because of the audiobooks, I do have to hit deadlines, so that John Lee has plenty of time to do his thing and make that production. Um, but I love what I do. I mean, honestly, this is I've run out of dream jobs. I'm doing precisely what I wanted to do since I was 13 years old, and I will continue doing this until I die, because you've never met a retired writer. Um,
Amen.
uh, yeah, we just don't retire. We may stop selling, we may get writer's block for the rest of our lives, but you never stop being a writer. And so I've laid out a very ambitious schedule for the next 15 years or so. I plan on hitting it. And of course, there will be books that pop up into my head that I'll knock out. And I think the fastest I've ever knocked out a book was Shadow Mage, which I did in 9 weeks from start to finish.
Wow.
And I did it that way because I was so worried about how Court Wizard would be received, because it was from
Okay.
Lycander's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
it was a fairly boring book from a giant battle sort of perspective. And I got terrified that I'd lose readership over it, and so I dashed out Shadow Mage, which is one of the more fun and exciting,
Mm-hmm.
again from Paul and Tyndall's perspective, and it's basically a one big slash and hack adventure from start to finish. Um, but yeah, 9 weeks start to finish, from the moment I wrote word one to me publishing it on Kindle. That's how quickly I was able to knock it out. So I know I can do it, and
Uh-huh.
it's a fairly meaty book too. So
It's a really
um,
good one.
it is. I have to admit, and I stole from the best when I wrote it. I used Thieves' World as inspiration. I used Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser as inspiration. It's a buddy comedy,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Uh, we get introduced to Rondell's love interest quite unexpectedly.
The moment she shows up, like, just oh, so good.
Oh yeah, and we'll be seeing plenty of Gatina, both in her backstory and Shadow, the Legacy and Secrets trilogy, and yeah, she'll be around for a while, and
Good.
uh, because one of the things I want to explore is what happens when your best friend gets married, and all of a sudden and then you get married, and now there are four of you, and how do you maintain a friendship and a strategic alliance and all that when you know the
Mm-hmm.
wives are around, and whether or not they like each other, hate each other, or both. And I've seen all variations of that. So that'll be a lot of fun to explore, and I am indeed looking forward to not just writing Gatina, but exploring Tyndall's new love interest,
Mm-hmm.
which we'll be starting to do in more depth in book 16. Um, uh, it, it, and there will be at least one more Tyndall and Rondell uh, uh, book. It'll be
Awesome.
a spin-off single novel. The title will be The Golden Goblin, and it's kind of my Heart of Darkness pastiche.
Ooh.
Um, so yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be dark. It'll be twisted, and it'll be a major plot point on which the series will kind of inflect. So even though it won't be a main series novel, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing it as a standalone on purpose, just like I will be writing a standalone Dara novel,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which will be a straight up romance, because I'm familiar with the romance genre. Uh, uh, Not that I'm a huge fan of it, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm familiar with it, and I want to resolve Dara's romance and her romantic issues, um, but in a way that is realistic and
Mm-hmm.
instead of idealistic. And that'll be called Muse Tower, and they'll probably be two of the books I work on next year, after I get done with this current schedule. Uh, but book 16 is rolling along.
Awesome.
Shadowblade is rolling along. The Road to Vanador anthology, I'm basically taking the novella, and because of the economies of audiobook, I need to write about 4 or 5 short stories,
Mm-hmm.
um, to flush it out long enough to make it cost effective as an audiobook. And so if you enjoyed the Road to Vanador novella with Nolan
Mm-hmm.
and his, um, there will be stories involving Mavone, um, Gareth, Carmela, and Caswallen.
Oh,
Uh,
thank goodness Caswallen is getting.
yeah, everybody wants to see Caswallen. Caswallen is one of those characters that I put in as a joke, and it just
Mm-hmm.
got out of control. It's sort of the way that Olmec did, which is why Olmec had his own story in the previous anthology. But yeah, the problem with Caswallen is he's incredibly easy to write, and he's incredibly hard to write. He's your basic heroic adventurer character, who's kind of a cross between Captain America and the Tick, uh, and coming up with the right joke to wrap that story around. I'm still looking. That'll be the last story I write in that anthology, because I want to get the
Mm-hmm.
perfect joke uh, uh, to to do that story around. And he's a great character, he is, but he's so one dimensional that
Yes.
I'm afraid of writing him too much because I'll accidentally add some dimensionality to him. And I think that will decrease his popularity because he's just he's one guy who does one thing and he does it really really well,
Hmm.
and he frustrates everybody around him because he does stupid things and doesn't die, and he really should die for all the stupid things he does, but he's so absolutely committed
Hmm.
to his own ideals and his own perspectives on things, that he's unshakable. I mean, and great character to write, but again, you got to handle him carefully so that you don't violate your readers' expectations, and that you enhance them instead.
Terry, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
I would suggest let's see, about the work, I would go to the wiki page. There's a gorgeous fan wiki that was started by a couple of my fans. It had been going a year before I even found out about it. But people were so intrigued that they wanted to keep track of all the details and all the books. I've contributed some things to it myself and will continue. Some backstory stuff, some things that didn't make it on the page, but I thought were important enough to introduce. I also have, if you just Google search Terry Mancour, you'll come to my blog. Feel free to sign up for the newsletter. I put it out more or less once a month. And I usually wax expository on weird things that are happening in my life. And of course, drop when I'm going to do new releases, con appearances, all that. There are a number of other interviews on YouTube and reviews. David Green does an excellent job. He reviews every one of my books and does a surprisingly good job of bringing forth the essence of my book without spoiling it too terribly much. And I've actually learned things about my own writing by seeing how he reviews it. So he actually handed me a theme in one of my books, and pointed out that it was there, and I had no idea it was there. So I enjoyed that kind of interaction with my fans and my critics as well. So, but the easiest way is just to go to Amazon or Audible and put in Spellmonger or Mancor, and it'll get you started. Start with Spellmonger, which I continue to say the first book is the worst book. That was only the second novel I ever wrote.
Wow. For a
Yes.
second novel, that's fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I still think that I would love to go back and completely rewrite it from start to finish at this point because I am a much better writer now. But I learned a lot of things with that book. My first book being one of the Star Trek novels, number 20 of the Generation series, Spartacus, which I'm very proud of, but I'm very glad I'm an indie publisher. I publish independently instead of going through a corporate publisher.
Hmm.
There's no way a corporate publisher would have allowed me to do 15 books in 11 years.
Yeah.
Uh, and just have to mention this too. I wrote 14 of those since George R. R. Martin's last book in his series came out. And book 16 will be out by the end of the year, and it will, I can't tell you an exact date, but it will be before the next book in the George R. R. Martin series. And I will keep using that line till he finally publishes that goddamn book.
As you should.
As a matter of fact, I'm about to put a press release out that basically says indie author gets bored waiting for George R. R. Martin's Winds of Winter and writes 15 books of a fantasy series in the meantime. So, but by all means, sign up for the newsletter. I'm fairly active on Facebook. I'm going to try to be a little more active on some of the other social media platforms. But the fact of the matter is, the more time I spend doing that and fan interaction, the less time I have for writing. And I can only cram so many 14-hour days into a week. So
Yeah. Eventually run out of hours.
Yep. Yep. Coffee, cigarettes, and whiskey. That'll keep me going. I have no doubt. But thank you so much for having me, Terrence. I really appreciate it. I can see we're coming up on time, but I look forward to going back and listening to this, and I appreciate you reaching out to me.
Yeah, thank you again for coming on the show. It's been a blast.
Excellent, excellent.